Hello, everyone. My name is Avni Amin, and I work at the World Health Organization's Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research, where I've been based for the last 18 years working on gender equality and violence against women. I will be sharing some reflections with you all about the politics of addressing gender equality in global health and development policies, using the example of violence against women and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Thank you to the organizers for accepting for me to record this message and share it with you, as I cannot be on Zoom with all of you. So let's start with defining the problem. We know that women and girls constitute 51% of the population. Some would argue half or majority. Despite living longer, we know that the quality of life, their health and well-being is poorer, especially in low-resource settings. We also know that there has been a lot of evidence on gender inequality and how it influences their health outcomes, particularly at the individual, community, and family level, within families. However, what I would like to do today is really unpack how global health institutions, including governments, intergovernmental organizations, national stakeholders and actors, private sector, NGOs, etc., have addressed or failed to address gender inequalities in health policies, and particularly in ways that have actually had adverse outcomes for women and girls. In some areas of women's rights and gender equality, such as the right for girls to go to school or women participating in the labor force, there has been more progress. We've also seen more progress made when it comes to women's participation in the political processes. However, the one area which has consistently seen challenges, and particularly where there has been contestations, is women's rights to bodily autonomy. I think we can all agree that the right to bodily autonomy is one of the most fundamental human rights there is. And yet, the 51% do not have those rights in many ways. For example, in many settings, women don't have the right to determine whether they will have sex, with whom they will have sex, whether they will bear children, whether they will not bear children, and with whom to bear children. So rather than getting into all of these factors and why this happens and why women's rights to bodily autonomy are contested at the individual or community level, I'm going to focus at the structural level, specifically looking at the political factors that have shaped contestations of women's rights to bodily autonomy over the last 25 years. I will share 5 reflections with you. One is looking at the historical origins of the contestation of women's rights to bodily autonomy, including in the UN negotiations when it comes to global health and development policy setting. Looking at specifically the challenges of policy incoherence, and particularly how that plays out within the geopolitical contexts. I will share some reflections about the important role that feminist movements have made in advancing gender equality within the UN global health and development policies. I will also share some reflections about the role that religious entities have played at the UN negotiations on gender equality, women's health, particularly in the area of violence against women and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And finally, I will share some reflections about what role the UN can play, particularly what role WHO as a specialized UN agency focusing on health can play in this area. So just historically, when you go back to looking at contestations of women's rights to bodily autonomy, it is not new. Way back in the 70s and 80s, we had a neglect of women's rights, particularly on issues of violence against women and sexual and reproductive health and rights. The issues of violence against women and sexual and reproductive health and rights in the global health and development policy agendas were sort of historically put, or advocacy around this started in the 70s with tribunals that were organized by women's rights groups. Particularly, it started with women's rights groups in the North. where there were testimonials from survivors of violence. There were testimonials about experiences of women's experiences of contraception. A couple of things to bear in that historical sort of process in the 70s and 80s. Many countries were coming out of the post-colonial era. So a lot of these conversations started with women's rights groups in the North. In some cases, and particularly with respect to sexual reproductive health and rights, some Northern NGOs made an active effort to reach out to women in the South. This happened much earlier for the sexual reproductive health rights movement as compared to the violence against women movement, but even that caught up. In the 1980s, there was increasing attention and advocacy towards gender equality within the UN and outside the UN. And particularly, a lot of these things were playing out in the context of the Cold War, as well as other specific geopolitical contexts, such as the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So a lot of these things were in the backdrop of how member states took positions for or against certain aspects of gender equality and women's rights in the space of violence against women and reproductive rights. In the 70s and 80s, there was also a lot of influence of countries, certain countries, groups of countries by the Catholic Church, and that also played out in terms of where countries took position on gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And then came the 1990s. We came out of the Cold War, and those were what I would say the heady decade in terms of achievement for women's rights and gender equality. In 1993, the World Conference on Human Rights for the first time declared women's rights as human rights. In 1994, the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo adopted a bold program of action that for the first time shifted the discourse from population control to an emphasis on reproductive rights and reproductive health, putting explicit attention to issues not only on making contraceptives available, but also on quality, on women's choice, on women's rights to control their bodies, and on gender equality. A year later, in 1995, this was followed up with the Beijing Platform for Action on Women at the Fourth World Conference on Women that was hosted by China. And here too, there was a lot of progress made. There were 12 chapters on various aspects of gender equality, and violence against women was one chapter. And women's health was another chapter in which there was a lot of emphasis given to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So what happens in the decade of the 2000s? One would expect that coming out of 1990s, that there would be much more progress made. However, this did not happen. As the reviews of ICPD and Beijing +5 and 10 showed, that in fact, the rhetorical commitment of governments at the ICPD, at the Vienna Conference, and at the Beijing Platform for Action made in the 1990s did not actually bear fruit in terms of actual investments at the national level in financing and in programs. What also happened at the UN was that the MDGs came out, and the MDGs led by the technocrats and development economists actually was completely gender blind and did not have any targets that were bold and far-reaching when it came to violence against women or sexual reproductive health and rights. Instead, there was a very tame sort of target around reduction of maternal mortality and getting girls into school. But also what was happening in the 2000s was that, there was a culmination from the 1990s and 80s, in fact, of what people call austerity measures on low and middle income countries imposed by institutions like the World Bank and IMF. And many of the governments in these countries were imposing what we call health sector reforms, which meant retrenchment of public funding of health services, education services, and privatization of these services, which in fact had, as data subsequently showed, adverse impact on women's sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as on violence against women, as services like shelters, legal aid, etc., were all being defunded. In the 2010 decade up until now, what we are seeing increasingly is backlash We're seeing continued contestations against gender equality and sexual reproductive health and rights playing out in global development and health agendas. It's not all doom and gloom, though. We are making progress. So, for example, on violence against women, based on activism of decades before, there is now so much data on the prevalence of violence against women that finally it's being addressed as a public health issue, as a human rights issue on global health and development agendas, at least in rhetoric, if not in actual financial investments. We know that the SDGs that came in 2015 finally caught up to the rhetoric of gender equality and rights and had a specific goal, SDG 5, on gender equality, with specific targets around universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, as well as on violence against women, among other gender equality targets. At the World Health Organization, we also saw progress in sexual and reproductive health and rights and violence against women with the Global Plan of Action on Health Systems Response to Violence Against Women, which was adopted in 2016, which also recognized the importance of providing comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services to survivors of gender-based violence. So there has been pushing of boundaries on some areas, but there has also been retrenchment and continued backlash, predictably, for one issue, which is abortion. There's also continued backlash against the issue of LGBTQI rights, which in the decades of 2000, because of the HIV pandemic and activism by LGBTQI groups and by AIDS activists, saw more and more attention being paid to the stigma, the discrimination faced by LGBTQI groups. However, there continues to be backlash against any specific mention, inclusion, and rights of these groups in certain forums within global health and development. There also is resistance, even though there is progress on comprehensive sexuality education for young people. But again, this is a contested area of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So here we are in 2022, progress made, glass is half full, but also there is continued pushing back and contestations on these issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender-based violence, because the right to bodily autonomy is still not accepted as a given for the 51% of the population. So how does it play out in the UN in different forums? Is largely in the form of what I call policy incoherence. And how does it play out in terms of policy incoherence? So what we see, for example, is that it plays out differently whether you are at the Human Rights Council in Geneva or at the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council or at the World Health Assembly or on the Commission of Status of Women and Commission on Population and Development. These are all different UN negotiation forums for these issues. And depending on who is there negotiating on behalf of the countries, it plays out differently. So to give you a very concrete example, intimate partner violence was recognized as a target in the SDGs and the SDG 5.2 at the UN General Assembly in New York. But intimate partner violence continues to be contested at the World Health Assembly, for example, or in forums such as the Human Rights Council, where the term intimate partner gives a lot of discomfort to certain member states who oppose the idea that women can have intimate partners outside of marriage, or that there could be intimate relationships between same-sex couples. Another issue that always plays out differently in different forums is that of comprehensive sexuality education. So at the UN General Assembly, in the political declarations on HIV/AIDS, you have recognizing that comprehensive sexuality education is important for young people. You have a lot more progress in negotiations, but in World Health Assembly, again, there is a lot more resistance to the term comprehensive sexuality education, or the same might play out at the Commission on Status of Women. So what explains some of this policy incoherence is simply who is negotiating on behalf of the member states. At the Human Rights Council, it is human rights focal points of ministries of external affairs. At the World Health Assembly, it's health attachés. in the capitals of many of these countries, the ministries of health often have a more pragmatic approach on these issues, but the ministries of external affairs, who are often negotiating in these global health and development forums in New York or Geneva, have a different outlook and are much more circumspect, let's say, about national interests. So this is one of the ways the policy incoherence plays out. Another way the policy incoherence plays out is in topic-wise. So, for example, you will have a group of member states that will particularly advocate for issues of sexual reproductive health and rights, but the same member states will perhaps not even think about sexual reproductive health and rights, or think about it very differently when it comes to negotiations on climate change or on NCDs, not actually joining the dots and connecting, making the links between sexual reproductive health and climate change. And these same countries that are, more looking at more progressive rights-based norms and standards when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights will actually not think about the implications of, for rights and take a progressive stance with respect to health equity when it comes to vaccine equity. So what you see then is a divide between, certain groups of member states on these issues, whether it's on vaccine equity or sexual reproductive health and rights. And you'll see that there will be a resistance because of what some people would call a double standard in the way international global diplomacy plays out on different topics related to public health. The third area and a third way in which policy incoherence plays out is in government shifts at the national level. So you might have member states that take one particular stance or position on issues of sexual reproductive health and rights when they have a particular government in place, and that will change maybe 4 or 5 years later to a completely opposite stance, where the same member state might align with another group of member states when it comes to sexual reproductive health and rights. And we've seen this routinely with the issue of abortion, also with the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, where depending on who is in power at the national level, those member states might take completely opposite points of views over a period of time on the same issues. So what can we take away in a positive way from this is the importance of investing in what I call the power of feminist movements. Feminist movements have been consistently advocating for advancing gender equality and human rights when it comes to violence against women and sexual reproductive health for many decades now, and have been, I would say, perhaps the most influential force in any advances we have made in global health agendas on these issues. Feminist movements are not homogeneous. Of course, there are divides between the North and the Southern feminists. Of course, there are also divides in positions between what some would call radical feminists and more pragmatic feminists. And you might have other divides on positions such as abortion or on sexuality education or on sex work. However, what has been an interesting reflection of how feminists have managed to advance these issues is they have always managed to find compromise and consensus within themselves with the understanding that the power of the collective and solidarity and finding common ground is much more effective an approach to advance issues of gender equality and rights rather than taking more entrenched, polemic positions. Another cause for hope is not just feminist activists' role historically, but you also have more younger generation of feminists, particularly when it comes to the feminist activists who come from, who are actually advocating for climate change, for example, and the role of digital spaces, online spaces in enabling feminist activism and collective action and solidarity across the globe, which has actually been quite inspiring to watch. Maybe just to move quickly on to a reflection about the role of religious entities that have access to the UN spaces and how they have played out. It's important to note that there are religious entities who have observer status at the UN, and including one which has just recently come on board at the World Health Organization, as an observer status. So what you have is the access that religious entities might have to the UN spaces, to member states, to influence, to lobby. And often what is behind those religious entities is a lot of money poured in from other religious groups. These religious entities often play an influential role in brokering consensus and alignments between groups of member states that would never otherwise be on the same side. So you might see alliances between Catholic member states that have a Catholic orientation with Islamic states, because the Catholic Church has been, or the Vatican has been in playing a role in brokering those relationships when it comes to positions on abortion or on comprehensive sexuality education or on LGBTQI. And it's important to note that that is another influential stakeholder, along with now increasingly the private sector, corporations, and foundations, who also are getting more and more access, lobbying, and influential power over issues of sexual and reproductive health and violence against women when it comes to governments. So what do we take away in terms of the role of the WHO and the role of the UN more broadly? I would say the power of evidence. What we have is the ability to advocate based on data and evidence. Where I work, which is the Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health and Research, we have a research entity called the Human Reproduction Program, which is funded by a small group of donors who believe in sexual and reproductive health and rights and in gender equality. And that has actually allowed us to gather data, to be able to use data specifically on issues of abortion or on violence against women, and use that to make sure that advocates within the UN, outside the UN, are able to actually move agendas forward based on science and evidence. It's not always easy. And of course, it's not that the science and the evidence always has the power to win out when it comes to government negotiations. But it is important that this is an important role that agencies like WHO can and should play, is to really always stand behind the science and the power of the data, making sure that as much as possible we use that to advocate for approaches to gender equality and women's rights. So key takeaways. First is to recognize that policymaking when it comes to gender equality and women's rights to bodily autonomy are often influenced by variations in what one would call institutionalized sexism and misogyny in global health and development architecture. So it's important to be aware of it, to recognize it, to take action. It is also important to recognize that global health and development policies, particularly on gender equality and women's rights, will be influenced by geopolitical contexts, by domestic governments, realities, as well as alignment of different groups in terms of what might be happening contextually. The Ukraine conflict, for example, or the Syrian conflict, or the Cold War, conflict between Israel and Palestine. It's also important to recognize the increasing influence of private sector, corporations, NGOs, religious actors, alongside the role that feminist movements and civil society movements can play in advancing gender equality. It's important to make sure that we make strategic use of evidence and data in advocating for gender equality, and really making sure that advocates who are pushing the agenda on gender equality and women's rights have the kind of data in an accessible format to be able to use for it, advocate for these issues effectively. I have a list of resources, reading materials that I've prepared, which I will share with the organizers to pass them on to you. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best for the conference.